Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber Sea Risk Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Data is at the core of risk management. In other words, without accurate information, no risk decision can be trusted. Risk-based decisions require inputs that are timely, relevant, and trustworthy. In other words, decision quality depends on information quality. If the data is wrong, incomplete, or outdated, assessments become flawed, thresholds may be missed, and responses may be delayed. In other words, bad data leads to bad outcomes. Data feeds everything from risk registers to key risk indicators, dashboards, and treatment plans. In other words, data is the raw material of governance. That's why sea risk professionals must not only collect data, but evaluate its quality and the methods used to analyze it. In other words, it's not just about having data, it's about understanding what it means. On the sea risk exam, data issues usually signal a deeper control or process failure. In other words, if data is missing or unreliable, something upstream is broken. Good answers will show how data supports governance, not just reporting. In other words, data has to enable decision-making, not just record-keeping. Risk data comes from multiple domains. In other words, you must think broadly about what qualifies as input. Operational data includes incident logs, outage records, and change histories. In other words, data about system performance and service delivery. Security data includes system logs, alerts, scan results, and access violations. In other words, information from firewalls, endpoint detection, and intrusion prevention. Compliance data includes policy attestations, exceptions, audit results, and training completion rates. In other words, evidence that standards and procedures are followed. Third-party data might include vendor risk scores, SLA breaches, or attestations from external assessments. In other words, data about others who affect your risk exposure. Incomplete or missing data, especially across these types, usually points to a failure in the collection process. In other words, if information isn't there, the process didn't do its job. On the exam, if a scenario contains gaps in inputs, that's your cue to focus on where the process broke down. In other words, look for the weak link in data flow. Data can be collected in different ways and from different sources. In other words, method matters. Manual collection includes interviews, policy surveys, and audit walkthroughs. In other words, talking to people and reviewing processes directly. Automated collection includes SIEM tools, APIs, system monitoring dashboards, or cloud connectors. In other words, gathering information from systems continuously. Internal systems may include GRC platforms, HR systems, ticketing logs, and operational databases. In other words, the tools and systems you already use every day. External sources might include regulatory feeds, vendor reports, or industry alerts. In other words, information from outside the company that affects internal decisions. Choose the right method based on sensitivity, frequency, and the alignment between the control being monitored and the system providing the data. In other words, pick what works best for the situation. On the exam, pick answers that reflect structure and fit. For example, use automated collection for high-frequency security logs, not for policy feedback. In other words, think about the right tool for the job. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Aggregation allows raw data to become risk insight. In other words, it turns data points into a bigger picture. This step combines inputs by system, business unit, process, or geography. In other words, you build context by grouping meaningfully. Normalization is key. Different departments may log data in different ways, so formats must be aligned. In other words, apples must be compared to apple. Use common scoring models, standard terminology, and consistent frequency to make results comparable. In other words, alignment creates comparability. Always check for duplication and contradiction. In other words, make sure nothing is counted twice or misrepresented. On the exam, aggregation failures usually show up when two reports provide conflicting answers. In other words, if results disagree, something is broken upstream, it's often because aggregation rules weren't defined or enforced. In other words, standards were missing. Validation is what gives risk data its credibility. In other words, don't trust what you haven't checked. Validate accuracy, completeness, and authenticity of the data being used. In other words, make sure it's right, whole, and real. Use anomaly detection, cross-referencing, and audit trails to flag questionable inputs. In other words, don't assume, verify. Manual entries and stale data are especially vulnerable to error. In other words, old or human data is risky. Risk professionals must understand confidence levels. Some data is good enough for insight. Other data needs further review. In other words, not all inputs are created equal. On the exam, correct answers usually include a step that ensures validation before analysis. In other words, trust must be earned. Choose answers that protect decision quality by ensuring the inputs are reliable. In other words, data quality protects risk judgment. Once validated, data must be analyzed to produce insight. In other words, information becomes value through interpretation. Use analytical methods to detect patterns, identify anomalies, and correlate events. In other words, find what stands out. Link key risk indicators to specific scenarios. This helps you know when thresholds are approaching. In other words, make risk signals operational. Segment data by risk owner, business process, or system criticality to prioritize response. In other words, know where to act first. Visual tools such as heat maps and dashboards make it easier for executives to understand exposure. In other words, make the story easy to see. If a scenario says risk increased, but data wasn't reviewed, that's a missed opportunity to detect a growing problem. In other words, insight delayed is risk unmanaged. Automation improves speed and reduces human error, but only when it's governed properly. In other words, speed without oversight creates new risks. Integrate risk data collection into normal workflows using GRC systems or service management platforms. In other words, automate where it makes sense. Use APIs and connectors for real-time updates and autosyncs. In other words, keep the system flowing, set rules that trigger alerts when thresholds are breached. In other words, turn insight into action. Automation needs controls. Who owns the logic, who checks the alerts, and how are false positives handled? In other words, who watches the watcher? On the exam, automated systems without validation or monitoring usually represent a control gap, not an improvement. In other words, automation without accountability fails. Every stream of data must have an owner. In other words, someone must be accountable. Stewards are responsible for updates, quality checks, and communicating changes. In other words, maintenance is not automatic. Risk and control owners must interpret their data and escalate when indicators move out of range. In other words, data must be translated into action. Governance teams oversee how different data streams are aggregated and used. In other words, strategy controls process. Data lineage should be documented, where it came from, how it's processed, and how it informs decisions. In other words, traceability supports assurance. On the exam, look for answers that describe accountability and traceability, not vague data flows. In other words, strong governance requires transparency. Validated, structured data must drive action. In other words, the point of data is to guide risk management, update the risk register when new insights emerge. In other words, change what's recorded based on what's learned. Adjust response plans based on confirmed trends. In other words, adapt to reality. Inform governance reports, treatment plan updates, and stakeholder briefings. In other words, let insight influence leadership. Use verified trends, not isolated spikes, to update key risk indicators or treatment strategies. In other words, make decisions based on patterns, not noise. If a scenario says a decision was made on outdated data, the failure is in governance, not the system. In other words, responsibility lies in interpretation, not collection. C-risk exam questions about data often center around missing steps or weak controls. In other words, they focus on process maturity. If a question asks what's missing, check for validation, aggregation, or context. In other words, don't assume data just exists and works. If a metric is incorrect, check the input source or calculation logic. In other words, go upstream for the error. If data has been collected, ask whether it's been reviewed, aggregated, and analyzed. In other words, data flow must be complete. If insight is missing, the fix is usually automation, visualization, or accountability. In other words, clarity drives results. Best answers show structured, source-traceable, governance-aligned data processes, not just dashboards. In other words, systems must be controlled and decisions must be informed. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cyber Sea Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.